Hey guys, Block Squad 1000 here, and today I wanted to go through and rank the difficulty of the Soulsborne games. Except for Demon Souls, unfortunately, which I have not played, so maybe I should have waited to make this video until after I played Demon Souls, but hey, I wanted to make some Soulsborne content on this channel, and, you know, I don't really want to go and dig out my PS3 and stuff like that. Who knows? The point is that I'm going to be ranking the difficulty of Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, and Bloodborne, and see what I consider to be the hardest ones. And I'm not going to be looking at this from a rather, like, objective standpoint, per se. This is going to be entirely opinion-based, and I'm going to be looking in-depth into why each one is considered hard. In my opinion, each Souls game is considered hard for different reasons, and some of them are considered easy for different reasons. I'm going to go ahead and say right now that Dark Souls 1 was the one that I struggled with the most. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think that it's the hardest one. It just means that it's the one that I had the hardest time beating. Each one is factually harder than others. Dark Souls 1 has the most challenging mechanics, overworld design, stuff like that. Dark Souls 2 has the most bosses, and a lot of it boils down to really crappy design, admittedly. Dark Souls 2 had some pretty bad design choices. It's not terribly designed by any means, but there's a lot of areas that just make the game extremely hard to beat. And then Dark Souls 3, in my opinion, is the easiest one in general, but it also has the most mechanically complex bosses. The bosses in Dark Souls 3 are way more in-depth, have a lot more moves and abilities, they have like a lot more mechanics to try to deal with, and in general I think that that's why Dark Souls 3 has the best bosses. Bloodborne, on the other opinion, is way more faster paced, and I think that it has the hardest lineup of bosses, and it also has probably some of the most challenging areas, but in general I think it's also the shortest Soulsborne game, and it's just, I don't know. My first playthrough, I struggled with that game, but on recent playthroughs, I think it's one of the easier ones. So anyways, I would like to go ahead now and talk about Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 1 I played first a couple of years ago, I'd say roughly a year and a half ago at this point, and it is one of my favorite games of all time. And since I had never had any experience prior to that, I sucked at it a lot. It took me a long time to get through that game. I'm gonna say about like 50 hours to beat it, and I know that some people might groan at that because the game roughly on average takes about 30 hours to beat. But I sucked at it, and that's no questions asked. I think that the game is probably the most challenging Souls game from a pure level design standpoint. The game has the most complex world of the entire Soulsborne franchise. It has way more intertwining paths and stuff like that. A lot of the areas are really challenging. The bosses themselves aren't necessarily very complex, in my opinion, aside from a few like Ornstein and Smo, or Knight Artorias, stuff like that. However, I do feel that the bosses in this game are also challenging from a, like, they're much more intimidating, I guess, than a lot of bosses in the other games. I find that Dark Souls 1 bosses are the hardest ones to deal with because it's hard to get through the boss without feeling stressed out. I know that sounds really dumb and it's probably just on me for feeling that way, but I do find that a lot of the bosses in Dark Souls 1 are hard to master. And I don't know if that's... Another thing has to do with the fact that Dark Souls 1 has some pretty... I'm not going to say bad controls, but I'm going to say that the controls are way hard to... They haven't aged well, especially compared to, say, Dark Souls 3, which in my opinion controls so fluidly and has so many quality of life additions that may have made it way more accessible and casual, I guess. I'm not going to go that far, but I do feel like Dark Souls 3 added a lot of additions that just make Dark Souls 1 way harder to go back to in terms of controls. For example, the game only has 4 directional rolling. You can't drink and move at the same time, like the Estus. And I feel like the rolls are a lot stranger because, I mean, it just feels clunkier in comparison to Dark Souls 3, for example. Dark Souls 1, also, admittedly, especially in the second half, has a lot of garbage game design, and that's why a lot of people consider Dark Souls 1 to be a flawed masterpiece, because it's probably the closest that a Souls game has gotten to perfect, yet the entire second half of the game is full of really bad stuff, and that's just because the game was rushed in the second half, and so that's why people consider it a flawed masterpiece. In my opinion, the second half of the game is really tough, and that's just because of how bad the design is in that part of the game. The entirety of Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith is just a slog to go through. The Tomb of the Giants is hell. Like the New Londo Ruins, I suck at that area so much. I think that it's probably the part of the game that I struggled with the most. There's also Anor Londo, which, in my opinion, I will never, ever master that area. I'm serious. No matter how much I play Dark Souls 1, most of my playthroughs end at Anor Londo because I just do not have the patience to master it. It is so hard. So, yeah, that's basically that. So Dark Souls 1, all in all, it's challenging because of the sort of datedness of the controls. The level design is really, really, really hard, and some of the second half of the game isn't designed very well. So in general, Dark Souls 1 is hard mostly from a mechanics standpoint and a game design standpoint. Dark Souls 2 is a similar case because Dark Souls 2 has a lot of bad design, and that mostly comes from the fact that they overstuffed it with bosses. A lot of the stuff in, like, mostly the optional bosses, for example, and some of the main story bosses as well, are just not fun at all. Probably my most hated boss in the entire Souls series comes from Dark Souls 2, Ludin Zalin, the King's Pets. I hate that boss, and especially the area that precedes it. And yeah, that basically sums up all of Dark Souls 2. A lot of the areas and bosses just aren't very fun to go through, and because there's so many of them, it can make it pretty annoying for people like me who like to get every single boss. Dark Souls 2, I don't think has very challenging level design, but I think it has to do with the enemy placements, especially in the Scholar of the First Sin edition, which is the one that I played. The enemy placements in that version of the game are really unfair, and a lot of people agree with me on that one. It's not very uncommon to feel that way. The Scholar of the First Sin, for example, take Hyde's Tower of Flame with all the giant knights. There's like so many of them, and then there's like the puppet knights or whatever they're called. Sorry, like the Hyde knights, I think. Yeah, I think that's what they're called. They move around like puppets, and they're super hard to dodge and attack, and they do way too much damage, and in general, they're just so frustrating. Another example is in No Man's Wharf, which is an area that is full of like way too many enemies in my opinion, and there's no bonfire there either. There's only some shortcuts you can open up. But in general, I find that the enemies are placed in such bizarre spots that it almost feels like you need to play really scummy in order to get through it. And I don't know, I usually just opt to run past everything because in areas like that it's just super annoying. And then back to what I said before about Ludin Zal and the King's Pets, there's the Frigid Outskirts, which is the most awful area in the whole series, even worse than the Lost Izalith, even worse than, like, are there any bad areas in Dark Souls 3 that I can think of? I don't know. Even worse than the Nightmare Frontier in Bloodborne, stuff like that. It's just so bad. It's this giant wasteland, you can't see anything half the time, it takes way too long to cross with almost nothing in between, just giant reindeer enemies that are super hard to kill and have stupid hitboxes that are impossible to dodge. It's like almost luck-based if you can even make it through that area. I hate it, and I don't even know who made that area, but they should have been fired. I'm just kidding. I don't wish anybody to get fired, because that'd be horrible. But anyways, so yeah, basically Dark Souls 2 has a lot of similar issues to Dark Souls 1. Well, not issues, but stuff that makes it difficult. In some cases, issues like what I just said about the Frigid Outskirts. What I'm trying to say is that Dark Souls 2 has a lot of similar difficulty, like things that make it difficult to Dark Souls 1. One other thing that I can say about Dark Souls 2 is that it took me the longest to beat, and it's just because of how many bosses there are. Dark Souls 1 took me 50 hours, this one probably took me about 65 hours, and that's just because of certain bosses, like Ludin Zalin. Every single thing I talk about this game, it always links back to Ludin Zalin, it seems. yeah, Dark Souls 1 has 20... With DLC, I think it's 26 bosses? Don't count me on that, but I think it's 26. Then, then Dark Souls 2 has something like 43. Yeah. Yeah, it's insane how many bosses are in Dark Souls 2. Meanwhile, Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 keep it rather low. Bloodborne has 23 bosses, and Dark Souls 3 has 25. Yeah, all these include DLC, by the way. Base game is a bit lower. So yeah, the Souls games in general have like an average number of bosses around 20, like mid 20 something, but then Dark Souls 2 just takes it way too far with all the bosses. It's insanity. So yeah, Dark Souls 2, in terms of overall difficulty, I think that it ranks as the second easiest. It has a lot of stuff that make it hard. One thing that I forgot to mention actually is the fact that Dark Souls 2 has like a health bar that'll lower every single time that you die, so you'll have less maximum health. There's a ring that actually undoes that basically by lowering the amount of health that you lose every time you die, and you can obviously undo it by using the human effigies. But yeah, it still makes it pretty hard, especially in the early game. The game also has this stat called adaptability, where dodge rolls aren't determined by the iframes or whatever. Well, it is. Basically, adaptability increases the amount of iframes that you have when you dodge. So in a sense, you are very underpowered when you dodge with low adaptability. Or it's like you have a much higher chance of getting hit, basically. So you have to be super precise with your dodging, and sometimes it feels borderline unfair. But adaptability in general, once you raise it to a certain stat, then I feel like it's a cool concept, but it wasn't implemented well enough. It just makes it feel unfair whenever you die because you missed a dodge, because sometimes it doesn't feel like your fault, but rather the game is just punishing you for stupid reasons. So yeah, Dark Souls 2, like I said, it's probably the second easiest, only behind, you guessed it, Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3, in my opinion, is absolutely the easiest Souls game, and I don't know if that has to do with my experience with the series, or rather just the quality of life additions like I mentioned before. Dark Souls 3 has a lot of stuff in it that makes it the easiest, including the fact that you can walk while drinking Estus, the fact that you get a lot more stamina, the fact that your attacks swing a lot faster, the fact you get way more iframes whenever you dodge. Basically, the game adapted a lot of stuff from Bloodborne, which we'll get to in a bit. And the game, I feel like Bloodborne was adding Bloodborne type gameplay to Dark Souls was a cool idea. I just don't know if it was implemented all that well, because it makes you feel extremely overpowered. Another thing that they added is also the fact that you can no longer upgrade armor. You can no longer upgrade armor, so it makes armor a lot easier to deal with. And I also felt that your equip load in general in the game was... Well, actually, no. The equip load, I just never really had a problem with it. I can always wear, like, much heavier armor and weaponry and stuff like that, and I never really had trouble with dodge rolling. There's also the fact that they simplified a lot of stats. A lot of stats were removed from the game and replaced with others. Yeah, the game in general just has a lot of stuff to make it a lot more accessible, and I think that those were for the best, because it makes the game a lot more fun to play, but at the same time, it does just make the game a lot easier. Take a lot of the bosses, for example, like Pawn of Sullivan. That boss is pretty hard in my opinion, but because of the fact that you get such a large amount of stamina in the game, I feel like it's a lot easier because of that. There's only a handful of bosses in the game that I think are truly hard. Pontiff being one of them, the other one being Sister Frida, and I don't know, like those two are honestly the only ones that I can think of that I ever really have a lot of. Oh yeah, I guess there's the Demon Prince. Those three bosses I have a lot of trouble with. The rest of the bosses, though, I can't say that I ever really struggle with them. Dark Eater Madeir, everybody complains about that boss for being super hard. I never really have any hard time with that boss. Slave Knight Gale's pretty easy as well, in my opinion. And pretty much all the main game bosses, with the exception of Pawn of Sullivan and, well, yeah, Pawn of Sullivan, with the exception of that boss, are pretty easy. And I know that some people might disagree with me on that. But that's not to say, I did say this, Dark Souls 3 has the most mechanically complex bosses. So like I said, it might just be because of my series experience that I find Dark Souls 3 to be the easiest, and with the addition of the fact that they added a lot of quality of life changes, Dark Souls 3, I feel like it's entirely down to your experience with the series. If you're a newcomer, Dark Souls 3 might be the hardest, and Dark Souls 1 might be the easiest, but for me it's the opposite. I can never seem to get good at Dark Souls 1, but Dark Souls 3 I have the easiest time with. I want you guys I'm actually curious. I want you guys to tell me what your experience with Dark Souls 3 is, because I want to know myself how other people feel about the difficulty in that game. Also, the areas in Dark Souls 3 are pretty challenging in my opinion. Not all of them, but a handful of them give me a lot more trouble than most of the areas in the other games. In general, the areas don't really hold a candle to the bosses in my opinion, but I did find that Dark Souls 3 has some pretty tough areas. Next up is the fact that they're basically removed poise from Dark Souls 3, and I feel like this actually makes the game a lot easier as well. A lot of the bosses have poise, which is good, but the enemies usually have very low poise, so you can stun lock them. This makes the areas a little bit less challenging to get through, but they also decided to make the areas a lot gankier. They made the areas full of enemies, but obviously you can stun lock them, so I feel like it balances itself out in a sense. I felt like because they basically removed poise, I felt like a lot of the enemies are super easy in Dark Souls 3. So yeah, that's basically all the coverage of Dark Souls 3 that I can think of. So all in all, Dark Souls 3 is the most mechanically complex, but it's also the easiest from a gameplay standpoint because they just made it so accessible. So because of that, I do believe it's the easiest in the series. And finally, we come to Bloodborne. And this one, in my opinion, I'm just gonna say this right now, and I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for this. I actually think that Bloodborne might be the hardest by a long shot. And I know that I said Dark Souls 1 was the hardest for me, and that's just because I suck at that game. But I think if I'm talking from a pure gameplay standpoint, Bloodborne is absolutely the hardest. Bloodborne, first of all, I struggled. I mean, I struggled with the game in my first playthrough, but it didn't take me quite nearly as long as Dark Souls 1. It took me about like 30 hours to get through the game. Obviously Dark Souls 1 took me 50 hours, so I guess that's saying something. But Bloodborne also has the absolute hardest lineup of bosses in my opinion. It doesn't matter how many playthroughs I play through Bloodborne, the bosses never, ever, ever get any easier for me. I just suck at the bosses in this game, especially in the DLC and some of the later areas. Even some of the early bosses I still struggle with. Vicar Amelia is hell to try to get through in the early game. And also there's the fact that they removed shields. Well, there are shields, but they're useless, which sort of hammers home why they basically put them in there. They're supposed to say, like, why would you need a shield in this game if they're useless? But yeah, the fact that they remove shields and you have to rely entirely on dodging and gun parrying, that makes it more challenging because you need more reflexes. In Dark Souls, you're encouraged to use dodge rolling, obviously, but there's still a shield option. You just have to be much more conservative with it. But in Bloodborne, you don't get that option at all. You need to use the only thing you can use is just your dodging. And this makes it a lot more challenging because a lot of the bosses are super aggressive, and so are the enemies as well. The game has a much faster gameplay style. You're encouraged to basically just be as on your toes as you possibly can. You're not supposed to let the boss be the offensive one. You have to be the offensive one. The boss will try to meet that expectation by being offensive as well. So it's just way more crazy, fast-paced, and just overall challenging because there's just such little there's nothing you can do about defense. You have to be entirely on your toes as you possibly can. Next off, there's the fact that a lot of Bloodborne bosses have super large health pools. I don't know if I'm the only one who feels this way or not, but I did notice that a lot of Bloodborne bosses have a lot more health than Dark Souls bosses. In general, Dark Souls bosses can be killed within like 2 or 3 minutes. Bloodborne bosses can take longer, like 5 or 6 minutes most of the time, in my opinion. There's a couple of bosses that are pretty easy, but I feel like a lot of them have really gigantic health pools, especially in the DLC. And then finally, the areas in Bloodborne are the hardest to get through in the entire series, in my opinion. The areas are so tough and very long and very challenging, and just even the first area in the game, it took me a while to get through that area. It's really big and confusing. The next area is also really big and confusing. And then the Forbidden Woods is like one of the longest areas in the entire Soulsborne franchise. Basically, Bloodborne is just so big in terms of like the actual level design, and I find that because of that, the levels are super hard. There's also the fact that the enemies are really tough in these areas, and they're so big and they're so challenging. Yeah, I think it all adds up at this point. Bloodborne is the hardest in the series, in my opinion. So, my entire point is that even though I think Dark Souls 1 is the hardest one for me to actually master, this game is the hardest one from pretty much every single standpoint. It's hardest from a gameplay standpoint, it's hardest from a mechanic standpoint, it's harder, it's just super challenging, and you guys might disagree with this. Obviously, this is entirely subjective. Everybody feels differently about the Souls franchise and how difficult they are. But Bloodborne is just the one that no matter how much I come back to, I always feel the challenge, and I don't feel that way in the other Souls games. And it's especially, like I was saying before, the DLC. The DLC took me forever to beat. The Hunter's Nightmare is a nightmare, as the name suggests. And then there's Ludwig, and there's Lawrence. Those two bosses are really hard. Then there's the Research Hall, which is extremely hard because of all the enemies that are sensitive to sound. A lot of the area is full of traps and ganky enemies that just are super aggressive and hard to beat and do a lot of damage. Then there's the Living Failures, which is a fairly easy boss, to be honest, but I still feel a lot of stress in that boss. But that's just because it's a much more patience-based boss fight than the other Bloodborne bosses are, but I feel like that boss is actually oddly challenging, and that's just because of how much damage they do. And then there's Lady Maria, which is not too hard. Like, Lady Maria's a great boss, but she's not too hard. My first playthrough, I did struggle with her a lot. But then there's Orphan of Kos, which in my opinion is the hardest boss in the entire franchise. Not a lot of people really disagree there. I think that a lot of people do. I feel like a lot of people feel that way, that he's the hardest boss. Or maybe you don't, who knows. But Orphan of Kos, I'm on my latest playthrough right now, and I'm fighting Orphan of Kos for the second time, and I still suck at that boss. Unlike Dark Eater Midir, or any of the bosses from the other games, I just cannot ever beat him, except this one time when I got super lucky by just parrying a bunch of times. So yeah, that basically hammers home that Bloodborne, in my opinion, is the hardest game in the series. Yep, and if I had to rank them, I think that my general opinion is going to be Dark Souls 3 is the easiest, then Dark Souls 2, then Dark Souls 1, and then Bloodborne. And then from what I've heard, Demon Souls is the hardest one. So maybe I'm completely wrong about all of this, and Demon Souls crushes all of them in terms of difficulty. I just needed to play it to find out for myself. But yeah, so that basically ends this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. And if you guys want to see more Soulsborne videos, please tell me in the comments. This is a very experimental video, and it probably sucks ass because I don't really do these kinds of videos all that much. But this is what I want to do on my channel now. I want to start doing more informative videos on top of my Let's Plays. I did it already with my previous video talking about Pokemon Let's Go, and I'm talking about Dark Souls and stuff. So yeah, if you guys like this video, tell me what I should do. If I should, tell me how I should improve it. Tell me if you want to see more Souls content. Just, fire away. And I will listen to all of you, because I don't really get that many comments anyway, so it's not that hard to see them. Alright, see you guys later. Bye.